The sweltering heat of April 1967 at Nui Dat was not merely a meteorological condition. It was an intrusive, suffocating presence that seemed to colonize the lungs of every man who stepped off a plane into the South Vietnamese interior. When the transport aircraft finally taxied to a halt on the dirt strip, its engines whining down into a low, metallic grumble, the rear ramp lowered to reveal 4 Australian soldiers. As they stepped onto the red dust of the airbase, the American Navy SEALs watching from the shaded perimeter of the operations building didn't see elite warriors. They saw an anomaly that bordered on an insult. These 4 men carried rucksacks so small, so deceptively light, that they looked like schoolboys on a day hike, rather than commandos entering a theater of war defined by its lethal complexity. There were no visible radio antennas stabbing the sky to call in the gods of fire, no bulky cases of specialized claymores, and none of the mountains of belted ammunition that American tactical doctrine considered the absolute minimum requirement for survival in a land where the jungle itself wanted you dead. The Americans, masters of the most well-funded military machine in human history, exchanged glances of pure, unadulterated skepticism. In the American way of war, capability was measured in pounds and decibels. To go light was to go naked. Someone in the massive gears of Pacific Command logistics had clearly made a catastrophic blunder. Perhaps these were clerks, or a skeletal advance party waiting for their actual gear to arrive on a later heavy-lift flight. But there was no second flight. These 4 men, dressed in drab, unmarked greens with expressions that revealed nothing of their origin or intent, were about to conduct the most consequential training program in the history of American special operations. They carried weapons that the Americans viewed as relics, and wore boots that seemed inadequate for the mud of the Delta. Yet they possessed a philosophy of warfare that had been bought with the currency of blood in the emerald hells of Malaya and the ancient forests of Borneo. It was a methodology refined through decades of institutional suffering, compressed into a way of moving and thinking that the most technologically advanced military on Earth had spent 20 years evolving in exactly the wrong direction. By the time the first major American combat units arrived in Vietnam in 1965, the United States military had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of conventional destruction. It was a machine designed, refined, and institutionalized around the titanic lessons of the Second World War and the frozen ridges of Korea. These were wars of masses, of industrial output, and of overwhelming firepower brought to bear against defined military targets. The method had crushed Nazi Germany and held the line against the communist bloc. But the problem with building an entire culture around the lessons of great victories is that the institution begins to mistake the method for the principle. The principle was to understand the enemy and the environment. The method was to blow it all up. The Americans had canonized the method and forgotten the principle. Thus, they produced officers who were extraordinarily capable at a kind of warfare that Vietnam simply was not. It was not a failure of courage or commitment, but a failure of institutional imagination. No amount of money or determination could compensate for the lack of a fundamental alignment with the reality of a population-based insurgency in dense jungle against an enemy who had been fighting foreign occupiers for 30 continuous years. The Australians knew this not because they were smarter or braver, but because they had already made the same mistakes and paid for them in the jungles of the 1950s. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment, SASR, was a direct descendant of the British SAS, forged in the North African desert under David Stirling's radical idea that small, autonomous units could achieve effects disproportionate to their size. But the SASR that arrived in Vietnam was not a copy. It was an evolution. They had spent 15 years in Southeast Asian counterinsurgency, learning that the most dangerous weapon was not a bomb, but a silent observer. The Malayan emergency had been their crucible. It required long-range patrolling, deep intelligence gathering, and a fundamental willingness to accept the slow, unglamorous discipline of waiting, a tempo that ran directly contrary to the aggressive, search and destroy culture of the Americans. The legendary gear inspection on the second day at Nui Dat became the moment the American tactical world fractured. The Australian instructors ordered the SEALs to empty their rucksacks completely. 80 pounds of equipment hit the red earth. High-output radios, massive medical kits, rations for weeks, every conceivable type of grenade, and enough ammunition to hold a hilltop for a day. It was the product of a doctrine that believed technology could solve the problem of a compromised position. The Australians walked the line in silence, their faces masks of professional indifference. They hefted the gear, asked about its necessity, and then delivered 3 words that would reshape the American Special Operations community for generations. Leave it behind. The protests were immediate. The Americans argued that the radio was their lifeline for air support, that the ammunition was survival in a sustained firefight, and that the medical kit was the difference between life and death. Every objection was reasonable within the logic of their training. But the Australians had a single question that functioned as a tactical guillotine. If the enemy knows where you are, what good is any of it? The silence that followed was the sound of a foundational premise being demolished. The American approach relied on the idea that superior firepower could compensate for a lost position. Get detected, fight your way out, call for a medevac. The Australian premise was the exact opposite. Detection was not a setback. Detection was total failure. The 80-pound rucksack was not a guarantee of survival. It was a guarantee of detection. It was the loudest thing the operator carried, making noise through the rhythmic thud of a weighted footfall and the labored breathing of a man struggling against gravity. The Australians were not asking the SEALs to carry less. They were telling them to be less. Less audible, less visible, less detectable by the enemy's senses, which had been honed by 30 years of war. This led to the smell doctrine, a lesson that American operators found most confronting. The Vietnamese jungle had an olfactory landscape built over millennia of human habitation. Wood smoke, fish sauce, specific vegetation. Into this, Americans arrived smelling of industrial civilization. Deodorant, shaving cream, gun oil, scented soap. Each was as foreign to the jungle as a signal flare. The Australians had learned to rub jungle mud into their skin and adjust their diets days before a mission to minimize the chemical signature their bodies expelled. They didn't seek to disappear entirely, but to close the window of detection from minutes to seconds, those seconds being the difference between a successful patrol and a fatal ambush. Then came the SASR shuffle, a movement technique that required a speed so dramatically below the American baseline that it didn't initially register as a military skill. One foot would lift with precise deliberation, hovering as the operator scanned the micro-terrain, then descending with complete attention to every potential noise source. A distance the Americans would cover in 10 minutes took the Australians 4 hours. The Americans initially mocked this as, quote, one believing that speed was safety. But the Australians proved the mathematics of detection. They vanished into the training area and allowed the Americans to try to find them. The Americans, moving at what they thought was a careful pace, were ambushed repeatedly by 4 men who had barely covered any ground but had remained totally invisible. The lesson was clear. You cannot lose a contact that is never made, and you cannot be ambushed by an enemy who doesn't know you exist. Their ambush doctrine was a categorical inversion of the American manual. While U.S. doctrine specified a 50-meter standoff for reaction time and fire superiority, the Australians practiced at 15 meters. At 15 meters, you can see the target's eyes and hear their individual breathing. It was a distance where discovery meant instant contact, but at that range, there were no missed shots. The engagement ended before the enemy could process the first crack of a rifle. A 4-man patrol could neutralize 20 enemies before they could even unsling their weapons. They would then withdraw into the green before anyone could determine the direction of the strike. The evidence was just bodies, no intelligence on numbers, no understanding of the method. The SASR left behind only fear. This required a mental discipline that no 3-week course could fully instill. Australian operators would establish an ambush and remain in total, frozen stasis for days, not hours. They would use containers for all biological functions to avoid leaving scent markers and allow venomous snakes to crawl over their boots rather than risk the movement of a flinch. This was the result of a selection process that saw an 80% attrition rate, looking for men who had genuinely stopped needing the things that make endurance necessary. In the end, the gap between the two forces was the gap between a technique and a culture. Captain Mike Walsh, in his classified report, noted that the Americans were the finest soldiers he had seen, but they were trying to acquire in weeks what the Australians had grown over decades. The Australians taught the Americans to think like hunters, not soldiers. They introduced them to the Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts. The Viet Cong didn't give this name to the Americans or the South Vietnamese. They gave it exclusively to the Australians because they were unknown. They were the shadows that could not be tracked, the killers who could not be found. The legacy of those 4 men with small packs didn't end in 1971. It seeded itself into the formation of Delta Force, the small unit autonomy of modern SEAL teams, and the patience-based intelligence gathering of today's special operations. The Australians taught the Americans that in unconventional warfare, the most dangerous weapon is the one that strikes from a position the enemy never knew existed. They didn't just change a few tactics, they changed the soul of how the most powerful military on Earth understands the silence of the woods.